This is the moment Formula One lost control, and it only took 3 races. Max Verstappen didn't just complain. He triggered a revolt. From jokes in Australia, to warnings in China, to a 50G crash in Japan that proved everything the drivers feared was real. Now the entire grid is united. Not against each other. Against the FIA. Because cars are losing power without warning, at over 300 km per hour. Speed differences hitting over 40 km per hour on straights. Overtakes that feel like a video game, not real racing. This isn't just controversy. This is a breaking point. Even race winners are questioning it. Even top teams are worried. And for the first time in years, the drivers are pushing back, together. But here's the twist. This revolt isn't just about safety. It's about the future of Formula One itself. And what Verstappen is really challenging could force the FIA into a decision they cannot reverse. Stay with me. At first, nobody thought this would go this far. A few comments. A few strange moments on track. Nothing unusual for a new era in Formula One. But what people didn't see was how quickly those small cracks were starting to connect. Because from the very first race, something felt different. Not slower. Not broken. Just wrong. Drivers weren't talking about pace. They were talking about feeling. About control. About moments where the car didn't respond the way it should. And in Formula One, that's the first warning sign. Because this is a sport built on precision. Every input matters. Every reaction is expected. Every movement is understood. Until suddenly, it isn't. That's what the 2026 rules introduced. Not just a new car. A new behavior. One that drivers couldn't fully predict. And that's where Verstappen noticed it first. Not as a complaint. As a pattern. He saw overtakes that didn't make sense. Cars passing like rockets, then suddenly dropping back. Speed that came and went, without warning. And that's when he made the comparison. Not to another racing series. To a game. Because that's what it felt like. And that single moment changed everything. Because once you describe something that clearly, others start to see it too. Leclerc saw it. Sudden power. Unnatural moves. Sainz saw something even more serious. He saw the risk. Because when performance becomes unpredictable, so does everything around it. And that's when he said it. It's only a matter of time. At that point, it was still just a warning. But inside the paddock, people were already connecting the dots. Because this wasn't about one corner, one lap, one race. It was happening everywhere. Every straight. Every battle. Every time the system decided to change the balance of power. And here's where it becomes critical. Because this system doesn't just affect speed. It affects decision-making. Drivers can't fully commit. They hesitate. They question what the car will do next. And hesitation, at 300 km per hour, changes everything. But even then, it still wasn't enough to trigger a revolt. Because Formula One doesn't react instantly. It builds pressure, data, evidence, until there's no way to ignore it. And that's exactly what happened next. Because the more races they completed, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't random. This wasn't bad luck. This was the system. A system that was supposed to make racing better, doing the opposite. And that realization is what started to bring the drivers together. Quietly at first, then more openly. Because when every driver feels the same issue, it stops being personal. It becomes collective. And once that happens, it's no longer feedback. It's resistance. And what they were starting to resist was not just the behavior of the car, but the direction of the sport itself. Because deep down, they all understood the same thing. If this continues, Formula One won't feel the same anymore. And that is where everything begins to change. And that is where the line gets crossed. Because once drivers stop adapting and start questioning the direction of the sport, it becomes something much bigger than a technical issue. It becomes a challenge to authority. And that's exactly what started happening next. The conversations changed. Not just in interviews. Not just on the radio. In meetings. Private ones. Serious ones. Because drivers were no longer asking, how do we make this work? They were asking, should this even exist? And that question is dangerous. Because Formula One has always been controlled from the top. The FIA creates the rules. Teams follow them. Drivers deal with the consequences. That's the structure. That's how it has always worked. But now, that structure is under pressure. Because the drivers are no longer accepting it without question. They're pushing back. And leading that push is Verstappen. Not because he wants attention, but because he refuses to accept something that doesn't feel right. He says it clearly. This is not racing. This is management. Energy management. System management. And that changes everything. Because once the focus shifts from driving to managing limits, the essence of the sport starts to fade. And other drivers feel it too. Lando Norris said winning doesn't feel the same. Because sometimes, it's not about who drove better. It's about who had more energy at the right moment. Fernando Alonso went even deeper. He said something that hit harder than anything else. That this feels like something drivers can't control. And if drivers can't control the outcome, then what exactly are they competing for? That question spreads fast. Because it touches the core of Formula One. Skill, precision, merit, all of it now being questioned. But here's where things become even more intense. Because while drivers are aligning, teams are starting to split. Some teams want change. Immediately. Because they're struggling. They don't understand the system yet. They're losing performance. Losing positions. Losing ground. For them, this regulation is a problem. But other teams have already figured it out. They've mastered the energy system. Optimized deployment. Avoided the worst effects. And now, they're winning. For them, this isn't a problem. It's an advantage. So naturally, they resist change. Because any adjustment could take that advantage away. And this is where the conflict explodes. Drivers pushing in one direction. Teams pulling in another. And the FIA stuck in the middle. Because now, every decision has consequences. If they change the rules, they admit something is wrong. They shift the balance. They create winners and losers. If they don't, they risk something even bigger. Losing trust. Because right now, drivers are already questioning the system. Fans are starting to feel the difference. And once that feeling spreads, it's very hard to stop. Because you don't need to understand the technical details to know when something doesn't feel right. And Formula One is starting to feel different. Less raw, less instinctive, more controlled, more calculated. And that's not what built this sport. That's not what made it global. That's not what drivers grew up dreaming about. So now, everything is building toward one moment. One decision. One response from the FIA. Because they can't wait. They can't delay. They can't ignore it. The pressure is too big. And the next race changes everything. Because when those cars go back on track, everyone will be watching. Not just for speed. Not just for results. For answers. Do the cars behave differently? Do the drivers push again? Does it feel real? Or does it still feel controlled? Because if nothing changes, this doesn't calm down. It escalates. More criticism. More division. More pressure. Until the question is no longer about fixing the rules, but about whether this version of Formula One can survive at all. And if it reaches that point, everything changes. Because Formula One can survive controversy. It can survive bad seasons. It can even survive unpopular rules. But it cannot survive losing its identity. And that's exactly what is now at risk. Because this isn't just about speed anymore. It's about meaning. What does it actually mean to win? What does it mean to overtake? What does it mean to be the best driver in the world? If the answer is no longer skill, if it becomes timing, energy, system optimization, then the entire foundation of the sport starts to shift. And that's what Verstappen is really exposing. Not just a flawed regulation. A deeper problem. Because when he says this doesn't feel like racing, he's not talking about one race. He's talking about the direction, the future, and whether Formula One is moving towards something unrecognizable. That's why this revolt feels different. Because it's not emotional. It's logical. Drivers are not reacting. They're analyzing, breaking down what's happening, and reaching the same conclusion. This isn't sustainable. Not like this. But here's where it becomes even more serious. Because the FIA is running out of room. Every option has consequences. If they make small changes, it won't be enough. Drivers will keep pushing. The problems will remain. If they make big changes, they risk breaking competitive balance, resetting the grid, creating chaos. And if they do nothing, they risk losing something far more important. Credibility. Because once drivers stop believing in the system, fans follow. And once fans follow, the entire structure starts to weaken. Sponsors question. Manufacturers hesitate. The long-term vision becomes uncertain. That's the chain reaction. And it's already starting. Quietly, but clearly. Which is why this next decision is the most important one the FIA has made in years. Not because of the rules themselves, but because of what they represent. Control, direction, trust. Because right now, all three are under pressure. And this is where Miami becomes more than just a race. It becomes a moment of truth. Because when the cars hit the track, there's nowhere to hide. No statements. No explanations. Just reality. Do the cars behave differently? Do the drivers trust them again? Does the racing feel real? Or does it still feel artificial? And within a few laps, everyone will know. Because Formula One always reveals the truth. At full speed. In front of the world. And if Miami shows that nothing has changed, then this revolt doesn't slow down. It explodes. Stronger voices. Harder pressure. Bigger divisions. Until the FIA is forced into something much bigger than adjustments. A complete rethink. Of the rules. Of the system. Of the direction. And that's the moment they've been trying to avoid. Because once you reach that point, you're not fixing a problem anymore. You're admitting it. Completely. And that's the final piece of this story. Because everything we've seen, the complaints, the warnings, the crash, the revolt, all of it points to one unavoidable question. Not whether the rules need to change, but whether they should have existed like this in the first place. And that is the question Formula One now has to answer. In public. On track. With the entire world watching. Because this isn't just a regulation debate anymore. It's a turning point. One that will decide what Formula One becomes next. And when a sport reaches a turning point like this, there's no quiet way out. Because everything that happens next will be remembered. Not just by fans. By drivers. By teams. By the people who define the future of Formula One. And this is where the final layer of this story reveals itself. Because the revolt was never the beginning. It was the result. The result of decisions made years ago. When these rules were designed. When priorities were chosen. When trade-offs were accepted. Because the 2026 regulations were never just about racing. They were about image. Sustainability. Manufacturers. A new direction for the sport. And all of that mattered. But in chasing that future, something else was compromised. Something fundamental. The connection between driver and machine. And now, that compromise is visible. On every straight. In every overtake. In every moment where the car behaves in a way the driver didn't expect. That's what this entire revolt is really about. Not just fixing a problem. Restoring that connection. Because without it, Formula One becomes something else. Something more controlled. More calculated. Less human. And that's the line drivers are refusing to cross. That's why Verstappen pushed. That's why others followed. Because once you lose that connection, you don't just change the sport. You replace it. But here's the reality the FIA is now facing. They can adjust numbers. Modify limits. Refine systems. But they cannot easily restore what was lost. Because that wasn't a setting. It was a consequence. A consequence of how everything was designed to work together. And that's why this situation feels so difficult to solve. Because the problem isn't isolated. It's structural. And structural problems take time. Time the FIA doesn't have. Because the sport is moving. The calendar continues. The pressure builds. And every race without a clear solution pushes this closer to a breaking point. But here's where everything becomes clear. Because at some point, a decision has to be made. Not about adjustments. About direction. Do they protect the system? And try to refine it over time? Or do they step back? And accept that something deeper needs to change? That's the real choice. And it's not just technical. It's philosophical. What matters more? Innovation. Or racing. Technology. Or control. The system. Or the driver.